True or false? St. Peter was the first bishop of Rome. False. True or false? St. Peter was succeeded by a singular bishop in Rome. Also false. True or false? The Bishop of Rome was seen as the leader of all bishops in the early church. False. True or false? The Bishop of Rome could settle questions about church teaching all by himself in the early church. False. If all of these statements are false, though, how did we get from a lowly fisherman to a powerful, almost monarchical ruler of all bishops who has the authority to regulate all things about the church, from its teachings to its administration? As an American Catholic, one of the biggest theological topics I see other denominations misunderstand is the papacy. In fact, one of the causes of this misunderstanding has to do with fellow Catholics misunderstanding our own history and thus misrepresenting the papacy to our Christian brethren. Peter was not the first bishop of Rome. In fact, Rome probably didn't have a singular bishop governing it for the first couple centuries of Christianity. The Bishop of Rome, the Pope as we call him today, was not recognized as the leader of all bishops for centuries, if not millennia. And he certainly wasn't recognized as the end-all, be-all settler of doctrinal questions until nearly 2,000 years after St. Peter died. This series, which draws on Klaus Schatz's phenomenal Papal Primacy, will attempt to paint an accurate picture of the development of papal authority. I will do so by trying my best to present an honest history of the Pope's role in the Church. Because to understand the Pope's authority, one has to understand the reasons why his office accumulated so much power, which requires a good historical perspective. For this sake, Schatz's work is the best I've ever read. I highly recommend it, and let's dive right in. One of the biggest problems about early church history is, well, how little first-hand information we have about it. The lives of the earliest Christian leaders and saints were often compiled hundreds of years after their deaths. Because of this, the lives of these saints were often caked with myths and legends, which means the genre of literature of these stories isn't biography as much as they are hagiographies, or idealized accounts of their lives. Because of this tendency to cake real lives with mythical elements, it becomes quite difficult to have accurate biographies of early Christian leaders. So you can imagine how difficult it is to have an accurate biography of St. Peter, who is traditionally recognized as the first pope. Well, what can we say for certain about him? Peter was the leader of the apostles. We know this not only because several distinct ancient sources recognized him as such, but because every early Christian author listed him as first when they named the apostles. This is significant because in ancient cultures, name order signified importance. Some Gospels even say that Peter was the first to witness the resurrection. The fact that the Gospels contradict each other on this matter, and that the later sources in particular insist it was Peter, not Mary Magdalene, who saw Jesus first, shows that early Christian writers wanted to cement Peter's legacy as a first among the disciples. Speaking of which, you can learn more about the witnesses of the resurrection in my series on the historicity of the resurrection. The point is that early Christians held a remarkable esteem for Peter quite early on. Now, did the apostles intend on Peter holding a position of authority that would be passed down through the generations? Well, we don't know. There's so much speculation about Jesus' intentions, but there are two facts we do know. One, early Christians universally believed Jesus placed Peter as the cornerstone of his church. And two, Jesus clearly intended for his church to be unified. In fact, he promised several times that he would never leave his church, which was to remain one. So after Jesus resurrected, Peter went to Rome, right? Nope. Peter went all over the place, but Rome was his final destination. And when Peter did go there, it already had an established Christian community. We know this because of St. Paul's letters to the Romans. Not only were Christians active in Rome, but it appears that Roman Christians were very well organized with bishops, who were considered elders in their communities, and deacons, who served as their assistants. Fun fact, the office of priest had not yet been distinguished from that of bishop. This means that Peter was not technically the first bishop of Rome. A brief aside, the fact that the church established the positions of deacon, bishop, and eventually priest quite early on showed an enthusiasm for structure and order. The reason for this is commonly invoked in the final books of the New Testament. With so many false prophets and teachers roaming around, the church needed a way to distinguish the authentic preservers of Christ's message from inauthentic ones. So, from its earliest days, Christians knew they needed leadership to stay unified. Let's back up for a second, though. How do we know Peter was actually in Rome? I mentioned that the lives of the early saints were often embellished with legends. How do we know that the late Peter actually lived and died in Rome? Well, let's look at our sources. First of all, 1 Peter chapter 5 verse 13 says that Peter went to Babylon, which was a common euphemism for Rome by Jews and Christians in the 1st and 2nd centuries. John 21 verses 18 through 19 also allude to Peter's death in Rome. Beyond the canonical New Testament, the first epistle of Clement, written around 95 AD, contains a reference that suggests Peter and Paul died in Rome between 64 and 67. Ignatius of Antioch's letter, written around 110 AD, also suggests that Peter had been in Rome. The apocryphal, meaning non-canonical, writings of the Bible also support Peter's activity in Rome, as the Ascension of Isaiah and the Apocalypse of Peter say he was there. Even though these books aren't canon, they are still legitimate historical documents. This is pretty important. There are no significant competing theories in early Christianity as to where Peter spent his late life and died. There seems to be a universal consensus among early Christians that he died in Rome. This is significant as mythical and legendary elements of saints often contradict each other. Several different churches, in fact, in very different parts of the world, for example, claim to have the same relic or burial place of a saint. But nobody in the early church seemed to contest the narrative that Rome was the final resting place of St. Peter. We can thus conclude that the evidence makes it pretty clear that Peter died in Rome. Finally, I should mention that excavations in the 1900s under the Basilica of St. Peter, which claims to have his remains, did find someone buried there, and the body seems to have been from around Jesus' time. The case seems pretty closed. Peter died in early Rome, and he was martyred by Roman rulers. There is no counter-narrative from early Christianity that challenges this. This is quite significant. Early Christians considered the sites of their martyrs to hold special sanctity, which we will return to later in this series. Well, after Peter died, did he have a chosen successor? Did he command the bishops from the other cities? There's not much historical evidence of the former, and the answer to the latter is most certainly no. When Peter died, what was the state of the Roman Church? Again, we don't have a lot of information about this time period from unbiased and contemporary sources, but we can say this. It was universally accepted that Peter was the leader of the apostles, that he died in Rome, that Jesus intended on the church to be unified, and that this unity required a hierarchy. This quest for unity, as you will see, will be the driving force that spurred the growth of the papacy for over 2,000 years, and we will explore the causes of that growth in the rest of this series. Until next time, have a great day. God bless you.